In this TechCorner video, I want to talk about the exposure triangle and stops of light. When you first get into photography, all the settings seem extremely overwhelming, so you decide to stick with auto as it seems to do a pretty good job most of the time. Now, as advanced as cameras are these days, they still have no idea what you are photographing or the look you're going for. All they look at is how much light is entering the camera and make adjustments to settings which are not always correct. But as you get more into photography and want to start creating more interesting photos, sooner or later you will need to accept that you need to learn about the exposure triangle and the dreaded M setting. This video is part 1 of 2 and covers the theory. Part 2 will go into real-world application where you will learn how to select the best settings regardless of your situation. I strongly suggest you watch this video first before watching part 2. Once you understand what the exposure triangle is all about, you will be able to look at a scene and figure out fairly quickly what settings you need to get the look you're after and how to adjust your settings to suit your situation. Now, at first, this all might seem a bit overwhelming, but stick with me, keep practicing, and this will all become second nature. I'm sure when you first started driving, it all seemed overwhelming too, but now you can drive from A to B without thinking about it. So what is the exposure triangle? Exposure is dependent on 3 things: your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. 3 variables, hence a triangle. To get a correct exposure, you literally can use thousands of different combinations of the 3 variables in a particular scenario and get the correct exposure. So this video will help you understand how to quickly pick the ideal settings. Now, before we get into the exposure triangle, there is one more term you need to understand: stop of light. A stop of light is a way of measuring how light needs to be added or removed to achieve the correct exposure. A stop of light is either doubling or halving the amount of light and is relative to your starting point. This will make much more sense as we go through this video. So let's start with ISO. I have a separate video all about ISO, but for the purposes of this video, ISO determines how sensitive your camera is to light. Typical ISO settings are 100, 200, 400, 800, so forth. Some cameras can go lower than 100 ISO, many cameras can go much higher than 1600 ISO. So as you can see from these settings, every time we double a number, we double the light sensitivity of the camera. So 200 is twice as sensitive as 100, 1600 is twice as sensitive as 800, and going the other way, 400 is half as sensitive as 800. So every time we double or halve the sensitivity of the camera by doubling or halving the ISO, we're changing the exposure by 1 stop of light. So going from 200 ISO to 400 ISO is 1 stop of light because we're increasing the sensitivity. Going from 200 ISO to 100 ISO is subtracting a stop of light because we're halving the sensitivity. So going from 100 ISO to 800 ISO is adding 3 stops of light. One from 100 to 200, 200 to 400, and finally 400 to 800. Hopefully this makes sense so far. So now let's look at shutter speed. Just like ISO, every time you double the amount of time a shutter is open, you add a stop of light. Every time you halve the time the shutter is open, you remove a stop of light. It is important to note that in most cases you are working in fractions of a second. So 1/100th of a second is longer than 1/200th of a second. Most cameras only show whole numbers when it comes to shutter speed and will display an inverted comma when your shutter speed gets to 1 second or longer. This means that when your shutter speed is less than 1 second, as the numbers increase, the shutter speed gets faster. Once you are at 1 second or slower, the opposite happens. So when you change your shutter from 200 to 400, you're actually changing from 1/200th of a second to 1/400th of a second. So you're speeding up the shutter by 1 stop. Therefore, you are taking a stop of light out of your exposure. If this doesn't quite make sense to you, just rewatch this video or comment below and I will be more than happy to explain this further. Finally, we get to aperture. This is where most people get confused and just give up. But stick with me and I promise these cryptic numbers will make sense. So up until now, working with stops has been relatively straightforward. Moving up or down in stops is simply doubling or halving the setting you're at. With aperture, it's slightly more complicated, but only slightly. On the aperture scale, moving from f1.4 to 2 is a stop. Moving from 5.6 to 8 is a stop. Moving from 11 to 16 is also a stop. So when you first look at these settings, it just seems like a random bunch of numbers going from 1.4 to 2 to 2.8 to 4, 5.6 and so on. Now each of these being a stop of light. There is a mathematical reason why this is the case, but that is beyond the scope of this video. So for now, you just have to trust me that that's the case. Now, the longer you work with exposure and stops of light, you will just end up remembering these numbers. But to get you started, all you need to remember is 1 and 1.4, and you need to be able to multiply by 2. So let's see how this works. If we start with 1 and 1.4, these apertures are one stop apart. Multiply 1 by 2 and you get 2, the next stop on the scale. 1.4 times 2 is 2.8. 2 times 2 is 4. 2.8 times 2 is 5.6, and we just keep going. The only anomaly is when you get to 5.6 times 2. That's technically 11.2, however this gets rounded down to 11. The 0.2 at this stage makes no real difference to the exposure and makes calculations much easier. You may have noticed that your camera has way more ISO, shutter and aperture options to choose from than what I've showed you here. That's because most cameras can be adjusted by a third of a stop, giving you much more control over your exposure. All you need to remember is no matter what number you are starting from, doubling or halving is a stop of light, and the settings either side are 1/3 of a stop. But now you're probably wondering, why do we even care about this? What do these stops have anything to do with photography? Well, I'm glad you asked. See, if you look through your viewfinder of your camera, or the screen if you have a mirrorless, you will find something that looks like this. This is your camera's light meter. Each manufacturer has a slightly different design, but they all work the same. The meter at its middle point shows you what the camera thinks it's the correct exposure. The large dashes or numbers are full stops of light, and the little dots in between are third stop increments. Once you venture into the world of manual, you will adjust your settings based on this meter to get the correct exposure. If you have followed everything in this video until now, you should realize that there are 3 different settings to choose from: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture to adjust a stop of light, and depending on what you change will affect the overall aesthetic of your image. If you shoot in auto or semi-auto modes, your camera uses this meter to determine the correct exposure for you by adjusting your settings in stops of light, without having any idea what you're photographing. Now in part 2, we will look at real-world examples to get you thinking about the image you are trying to create, so you know exactly which settings you change for the perfect shot. So this brings me to the final point. Your camera's light meter is not perfect and can be fooled easily to give you an incorrect reading. If you want to learn more about your camera's light meter, how it works and its limitations, I have a separate video on that and will leave a link in the description below. Thanks for watching this TechCorner video. Please comment below with any questions and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos.